Welcome to the Sleepless Historian, where history whispers you into a world long gone. I'm your host, guiding you through the dusty pages of the past with stories so immersive you might just drift off. Tonight, we're launching a brand new series, stepping into the cradle of civilization, Ancient Mesopotamia. In this first episode, we'll uncover why surviving a single day in those harsh, unforgiving times was a battle against the odds-blazing deserts, unpredictable rivers, and dangers no modern soul could imagine. So, settle in, dim the lights, and let's travel back to a world where every sunrise was a fight to stay alive. When I'm introduced to people at social situations like dinner parties, there's always that question we all get asked. So, what do you do? I'm a historian. Oh, do you teach? Yes, I'm a professor of ancient history. Ancient history, like the Greeks and Romans. No, earlier than that. I studied the ancient Near East, Mesopotamia. At this point, I usually get one of two looks. One is the glazed expression of someone trying to remember anything about Mesopotamia. The other is the quizzical expression of someone wondering why in the world I chose this particular area of study. How did you get interested in that, they ask, as though I'd expressed a passion for the study of something ridiculously esoteric, like the anatomy of olive pits. The reaction would be different if I were to say that ancient Egypt was my field of history. Everyone is fascinated by Egypt and has a really good PR team. So many specials and documentaries on TV, entire sections of museum bookstores, kits to teach yourself hieroglyphs, all those mummies and pyramids and obelisks. And if I were to say that I'm an archaeologist, again the reaction would be different. Archaeology has a swashbuckling aura. Archaeologists are fearless people who go to distant places and find mysterious buried remains from long-forgotten times. Unfortunately, Mesopotamia has no Indiana Jones. So my passion for this subject needs explanation, which underscores the need for this course. But I hope that after I've told you something about my work, you'll share my excitement for this amazing field. Mesopotamia is the ancient name for what's now Iraq. People have often heard of it because it was home to a lot of firsts. The world's first cities, the earliest writing, the first written laws, the first diplomatic relationships, along with a host of other things. That's all true. But Mesopotamia was much more than a place of firsts. Its civilization was rich and long-lasting, surviving for more than 3,000 years. In fact, Mesopotamian civilization lasted longer than the amount of time that has passed from its demise to the present day. Mesopotamian kingdoms flourished for almost 2/3 of the time that civilization has existed on Earth. Even so, those Mesopotamian kingdoms ended up being largely forgotten for thousands of years. In contrast, ancient Greek and Roman writings were kept alive by one generation after another of scribes, scholars, and students. The same is true of the Bible in the history of the Israelites. There's an unbroken tradition of classical studies and biblical studies from ancient times to now. The study of Mesopotamian history began relatively recently, with the decipherment of their writing system about 170 years ago. This was accompanied by a flurry of archaeological excavations in Iraq, Iran, and Syria, work that has continued ever since. The excavations revealed cities of great sophistication that thrived in an era long before the Greeks, Romans, and Israelites. And the excavations uncovered ancient documents by the thousands. More than 250,000 documents have been found, many of them still unpublished. Many haven't even been read yet. So being a Mesopotamian historian is like being an explorer of uncharted waters. We make new discoveries all the time. In most fields of history, everyone knows the basic framework, the timeline, and names and events that lie along it. Mesopotamia is different. Not only do unexpected kings, queens, and other prominent figures show up frequently, but when clay tablets are newly translated, entire kingdoms can emerge. There aren't many of us who specialize in ancient Mesopotamia, so there's no shortage of research projects. It's incredibly exciting to uncover new details of ancient civilizations, details that literally nobody has known about for thousands of years. Now, to answer that dinner party question, how did I get interested in this field? From about the age of 8, I wanted to be an archaeologist, but in graduate school, I decided I was going to be a historian, for reasons I'll explain in a moment. I grew up in a village south of London. My backyard was full of all sorts of interesting things. There were bowls of clay tobacco pipes and sharp fragments of willow-patterned china from the 19th century. I collected these and kept searching for more. My parents wanted to nurture my interest, so they found an archaeology program for kids at the local library. The group met once a week, and I was completely hooked. This was what I wanted to do. Later, as an undergraduate at UCLA in Southern California, a class on ancient Near Eastern archaeology captivated my interest, and I ended up taking the whole sequence of classes. I was also playing bass in a rock band. My days were filled with attending class and completing my assignments, and my evenings were taken up by the band. A couple of years later, I was back in England, doing a master's degree at the Institute of Archaeology in London. Well, my old band added a couple of new members and changed their name to the Bangles. They spent the late 1980s recording and performing around the world, but I'm happy I chose an academic career. I'd started taking classes in the ancient Mesopotamian language of Akkadian, which was written in a script known as cuneiform. Cuneiform signs are made up of straight lines with wedge-shaped heads. Cuneiform isn't an alphabet. Each sign could represent a whole word or a syllable, or even something called a determinative. Determinatives help the reader know what category a word belonged to. So you would find a determinative for city names, for the names of men and of women, and for things made of wood and so on. Each sign has more than one possible value, and each syllable can be represented by several different signs. So hundreds of cuneiform signs were used. Learning to read cuneiform and to understand Akkadian was thrilling. Reading the ancient texts was like being privy to a hidden world. So, when I returned to the US once more, I decided to do my PhD at UCLA in history rather than archaeology. Still, the two are closely tied together in the study of ancient Mesopotamia and Syria. Every cuneiform text that we read and study was dug out of the ground at some point, and knowing the exact context where it was found can add a whole additional level of understanding of its content. During graduate school, I got the opportunity to join an excavation. This was at the site of Tel Ashara in eastern Syria. What is now a small village was once a major city. It's on top of an occupation mound called a tell in Arabic. It's made up of the remains of all the settlements built on that spot over centuries. Anywhere you dig on a tell, you can't help but discover objects from the past. Of course, contemporary villagers had no interest in seeing their houses and yards dug up by archaeologists, so the excavations were mostly at the edge of the tell and in a city park. What was it like to work on a dig? It was unlike anything I'd done before. The team of graduate students and archaeologists I worked with lived in rented rooms in the village of Ashara. Our house was built in the same way that had been used there for thousands of years. It was made of mud brick, with the rooms arranged around an unpaved courtyard. There was no plumbing, and though electricity recently had been introduced in the village, and our rooms had electric lights, air conditioning wasn't one of the conveniences. Fortunately, though, it got cool at night, and the mud brick provided insulation against the sun. I often sat on the flat roof of our house in the evenings, and I watched the sun set over the nearby fields and the river. It was beautiful. We'd wake up each morning, before the sun rose, to excavate during the coolest hours of the day. The whole team ate breakfast together around a big table. Then we headed up to the excavation where the workmen met us. I was in charge of a 10 by 10 meter square. That's a little more than 30 feet by 30 feet. I worked with 2 villagers who did most of the digging and who moved the mud out of the square. They were experienced excavators who could find the edge of a mud brick wall almost by intuition. The distinction between ancient mud brick and the ancient mud that surrounded it was a lot less obvious than I'd imagined. I dug as well, of course, and it was my job to record everything we found and to carefully excavate anything small or delicate. As spring turned to summer, the village grew hotter. On a couple of days, it reached 117 degrees in the shade. At that point, we'd retreat to the dig house and work on our documentation. Later, the team gathered again at dinner time to eat and to discuss the day's finds. On Fridays, when no one worked, we'd take bus trips to other archaeological sites. These visits included the incredible Roman cities of Palmyra and Dura Europos, and the older sites of Mari and Tel Brak. Wherever we stopped, the local people would bring out blankets, and we'd sit and talk with them. Our hosts often gave us apricots from their trees, and they'd offer us glasses of sweet tea. The part of the site where I worked held the foundations of an administrative building from the 18th century BCE. We uncovered 2 burials, along with a well lined with large baked clay cylinders. One burial interred the remains of a tiny baby who had been placed in a jar in the courtyard. It was really moving to lift the broken pottery and see the tiny skull inside. And we found some cuneiform tablets. These consisted of a letter and some administrative texts. I realized as I excavated these ancient documents that until now, no one else had read them or even touched them from the moment they'd been abandoned about 3,800 years ago. The records would help us know who'd worked in this building and what they cared about. With only a little bit of imagination, those same documents could bring ancient Terka to life and repopulate our surroundings with their ancient inhabitants. Since that time, much of my research has centered on the findings from the city of Terka and the kingdom that it dominated, a kingdom called Hana, which thrived during the mid-2nd millennium BCE. Only a handful of scholars are devoted to the study of Hana, though it lasted for several centuries. Unfortunately, to date, fewer than 100 cuneiform tablets have been identified as coming from there. No doubt we'll know a great deal more someday in the future when more tablets have been excavated. They're certainly there in the ground somewhere. Now, we're lucky that the Mesopotamians wrote on clay. That's because paper, papyrus, and parchment all disintegrate over time. Papyrus documents typically survive only in desert areas. Otherwise, there's almost nothing left after a few hundred years if they're buried in the ground. As a result, there are giant gaps in our knowledge of ancient civilizations that used organic substances to document their lives. Although many documents do survive from ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome, and Israel, these are the ones that were considered so important that they were copied over and over again. Only a few managed to survive in the ground. So what's usually missing are records of daily life. The letters, administrative lists, contracts, court records, and so on that would give us a deeper understanding of their cultures and of people who weren't the movers and shakers. Now, these are exactly the kinds of documents that we do have from Mesopotamia, and we have them in huge numbers. Some ancient clay tablets were baked on purpose to preserve them. Others were baked by accident when the buildings burned down. Baked tablets are usually well preserved and like bricks. Other tablets were left out in the sun to harden. They might still survive in the ground, but often they fall apart easily, and they need to be pieced together and conserved. For the most part, these clay tablets were not intended to be preserved or to be read hundreds or thousands of years in the future. They're not like stone inscriptions or great works of philosophy or literature. that were copied and kept in libraries. Most tablets were quite practical. They were documents written for a particular purpose and then archived or discarded. They include lists of people receiving rations, lists of animals sent as offerings to temples, contracts recording the hiring of workmen, descriptions of court cases, multiplication tables, personal letters, records of loans, things like that. And literacy wasn't widespread. Scribes, the few men and a tiny number of women who were educated, fulfilled particular responsibilities. They don't seem to have written for introspective reasons. There aren't any Mesopotamian diaries, and even their letters tend to be very practical. So the insights we get into their lives are rarely personal, but there's a great deal that can be learned from the quotidian documents that survive. I often think about the people whose names populate the documents. I imagine that they'd be astounded to know that they've achieved a sort of immortality because of the clay tablets they left behind. We know their names, and the names of their relatives and neighbors, and the locations of their houses and fields. These were normal men and women who'd lived as farmers, priests, barbers, innkeepers, and still we analyze every detail of their lives. What social class did they belong to? Who were the members of their close social networks? How long were their generations? I'd recently added a new name to a Mesopotamian family tree that I'd worked on before. In doing so, I realized that two men, who obviously were friends, had given their sons the same name. And this is a minor curiosity. I couldn't help wondering who chose the name first, and if the friend copied him when naming his son. Billions of people have lived on the planet since 1750 BC. Even so, I feel a particular tie to the families who lived in Turkey all those years ago. I've stood in their courtyards and streets. The records we find in their houses and in their neighbors' houses have brought them back to our attention centuries after they've been completely forgotten. Fortunately, we can read these ancient words relatively easily today. This is thanks to the efforts of a number of 19th century scholars who deciphered cuneiform almost 2,000 years after it was last used. Of course, it's hard to decipher a script or language without a bilingual text that includes the same document in a known language along with an unknown one. For Egyptian hieroglyphs, the key was the Rosetta Stone. This is a stone inscription from Egypt, bearing the decree of a Ptolemaic king. It includes the same text in Greek and in two forms of Egyptian, so that all literate Egyptians could read it. The Greek version provided the key to understanding the hieroglyphic inscription. For cuneiform, one document that served this same purpose was the Behistun inscription. Unlike the Rosetta Stone, it's never been located in a museum. It's a giant carving on the side of an inaccessible mountain in Iran. The story is an interesting one. In 1836 and 1837, an intrepid scholar and adventurer named Henry Rawlinson climbed the mountain face several times. He made copies of part of the inscription. You're listening to The Sleepless Historian, where ancient tales lull you into history's embrace. Follow us at Comhistorica for more soothing stories. Like, subscribe, and let the past guide your dreams. He even made some papier-mâché molds of some sections. He realized that there were 3 separate versions of the text, all in cuneiform. And he guessed, rightly as it turned out, that they might be in 3 different languages. By 1838, Rawlinson and an Irishman named Edward Hincks had deciphered the easiest of the 3 languages, with the help of an international group of scholars. Hincks had worked on cuneiform previously, and Rawlinson used some of his insights. This part of the Behistun inscription turned out to be an ancient version of the Persian language. It used an alphabetic cuneiform script with 43 characters. Old Persian was enough like Middle and Modern Persian to be understandable, and the text proved to be a royal inscription by the Persian king Darius I, who lived in the 5th century BCE. The second version of the inscription had 131 different characters and was in an ancient language called Elamite. It was deciphered later by a different group of scholars. The last version of Darius's Behistun inscription turned out to be an Akkadian, the language that was spoken and written in Mesopotamia for centuries. It was much harder to decipher. Rawlinson went back to Behistun in 1847, 10 years after he'd begun the project, to work on this third version of the text. However, Edward Hincks had already completed a lot of the decipherment using different trilingual inscriptions, also from Iran. So it was known that this form of cuneiform represented a Semitic language. By now, Hincks had sent a number of letters to scholarly societies, in which he'd noted several important details about the script, and he was right about all of them. He'd even figured out values for many of the signs. But Henry Rawlinson is almost always credited with having deciphered Akkadian cuneiform. So, who really managed this feat? While both men worked hard during the late 1840s and 1850s, Hincks made the best progress. And we now know that he had the most accurate values for the signs. Rawlinson grew annoyed with his colleague and even mocked his conclusions. He suggested that Hincks had a few fortunate hits, but was mostly wrong. To start with, Rawlinson thought the cuneiform writing system had grown out of the Egyptian system, and he thought it was mostly alphabetic. He was mistaken. Hincks recognized that every cuneiform sign could be read as a complete syllable. Each one could be read as a consonant plus a vowel, or a vowel plus a consonant, or a combination of consonants and vowels. But not one of them represented a consonant all by itself. He was right about all of this. By 1857, Rawlinson had come around to agreeing with Hincks's conclusions. They and two other scholars identified the values of hundreds of cuneiform signs, and they mastered most of the grammar of the Akkadian language as well. In the same year, the Royal Asiatic Society in London came up with a test to see if the decipherment was successful. They gave a newly discovered cuneiform inscription to all four men and had them translated, independently of one another. Their translations turned out to be pretty much the same. The code had been cracked. Edward Hincks died in 1866, and Rawlinson ended up getting most of the credit. But more and more scholars now recognize that Hincks was the real genius who figured out the major keys to the decipherment of Akkadian. Students often ask me how we know what ancient Akkadian sounded like. We can't be sure of every detail, but Akkadian is enough like later Semitic languages for us to be pretty confident that we know how it sounded. We're also lucky that the script regularly reflects not just the consonants, but also the vowels. In this, it's different from Egyptian hieroglyphs and from later alphabetic scripts, like Phoenician and early Hebrew. Once Akkadian was deciphered, it was possible to decode some of the other ancient languages that were written in cuneiform. One of the most important of these was Sumerian. This was the language of ancient Sumer, the southern part of Mesopotamia, and it was probably the language of the ancient inventors of the writing system. Sumerian was used in literature and religion long after it had ceased to be a spoken language, so ancient scribes had long lists of Sumerian words and their Akkadian equivalents. These lists helped with the modern decipherment. Once cuneiform was understood, a great deal of work was done in translating Mesopotamian documents. This provided a lot of the groundwork for those of us who have come after those early scholars. They introduced us to great kings like Sargon of Akkad and Hammurabi of Babylon. They produced editions of law codes and royal inscriptions. They shone a light on a world that had not been known before, and they inspired generations of archaeologists to find and excavate the ancient occupation mounds where the cities and towns of these ancient peoples lay buried. Despite the longevity of their civilization over thousands of years, Mesopotamians faced constant threats. These could take the form of warfare and natural disasters, disease, infections, crop damage, famine, and deaths of loved ones. The Mesopotamians could control none of these, so they treasured the order they could maintain. They had close communities, and they valued and supported their friends and families. They developed a judicial system. They expected contracts and treaties to be upheld and obligations to be met. And they emphasized kindness and civility in their interactions. It always strikes me that they, or most of them at least, were people I would like to have known. So let's get to know them. In this course, we'll explore the Mesopotamian world from the era of the first settlements more than 12,000 years ago to the earliest cities in the 4th millennium BC, and we'll end up in the 6th century BCE when Mesopotamia was conquered by the Persian Empire during the reign of Cyrus the Great, and the people there were no longer ruled by a government within their own land. We'll look at religion, which pervaded everyone's understanding of the universe, and at kingship, society, agriculture, trade, justice, literature, art, warfare, daily life, and more. And we'll encounter some extraordinary people. Kings like Sargon, who created the world's first empire, and Ornama, who developed the first written laws, and Tushratta, who maintained an affectionate correspondence with the pharaohs of Egypt. Others were religious leaders like Enheduanna, a priestess who survived an attempt to expel her and wrote hymns about her experiences. We'll meet princesses like Kiram of Mari, who was so miserable in her marriage that she threatened to jump off the roof of her husband's palace, and authors like Sinleke Unini, who wrote the Epic of Gilgamesh. Some of the people who illuminate this era would never have guessed that they'd be remembered so many thousands of years later. These include Amat Shamash, a woman who bequeathed her house to her daughter, only to have her brothers contest it in court after her death. You might be surprised that a written will, spoken testimony, and justice prevailed on her behalf of the younger woman in the face of her more powerful uncles. All of these people, and millions of others like them, lived and loved, worried and celebrated during the long centuries of Mesopotamia's power. They cared about the events of their day with the same passion that we have for events in our lives. And they had no idea how things would turn out. It's always tempting to see history as somehow inevitable, that the way things did happen was the only way they could have happened. We reflexively tend to think of these people as simply going along with the script. But that's not true. Each person was an actor in this vast panorama of history, responding to the events of their time. But they had no lines to read. They were making it up as they went along. The documents and objects and buildings that survive give us a window into their lives. We can read their words, stand in their houses, admire their sculptures, and try our best to reconstruct their world and to understand them. Remember life before cell phones? We would leave home every day with no easy way to contact the people we planned to meet up with, or the people we depended on to pick us up from school or work. There was no way for someone to call us, if we were away from home, to say the traffic was bad or they were running late, or to be reminded of what to buy at the supermarket. And through all those years, we were fine. We didn't wring our hands and wish someone would hurry up already and invent cell phones. We didn't know the future would be so much easier. Later, we didn't wish that smartphones would show up. And it wasn't long before we were able to watch cat videos while standing in line for coffee. The technology that we had was all we thought we needed. When something new came along to change everything, it was a surprise. I mention this because we tend to look back at history and note all the things that were missing in any given era. What did they do without clocks? No printing press, no wheel, no plow, no plumbing. But of course, we have perfect hindsight and can see what an advantage it was to have those things once they were invented. The people who lived without them didn't know what they were missing. We also tend to assume that once a new technology appeared, it must have been adopted with relish. But was that true? It's often been observed that the spread of any technology tends to be slow. People don't leap to adopt the invention. First they wonder, what is it? Why might it be useful? How much does it cost? These aren't obvious at the time. You probably can think of examples like this in your own lifetime. I remember reading a magazine article about the internet in the early 90s and being completely mystified. How could one visit sites on a computer? What would be the point of doing so? We seemed to be getting along just fine without this new internet thing. Little did we know. All this brings us to the question of how and why agriculture originated and spread. The when and where are relatively uncontroversial. Early agriculture originated about 10,500 years ago in the Near East, around northwestern Syria and southern Turkey. But how and why? Those are thorny questions. Looking backwards from the present, we can see the enormous value of the domestication of plants and animals, and it's tempting to imagine that through all the thousands of years that humans were hunting animals and gathering plants, they were just longing for someone to get around to inventing farming, an invention that would allow them to stay in one place all year round and start accumulating possessions. Early theories often credited some ancient genius with noticing that plants grew from seeds in waste piles, and then planting seeds himself and finding that they grew. Voila, agriculture. According to this view, the self-evident advantage of farming would have resulted in mass abandonment of hunting and gathering and a quick shift to living in villages and storing surpluses. I'm exaggerating a little, but there was a sense that agriculture was an example of progress. There was also a sense that hunters and gatherers were, without doubt, at a disadvantage, and therefore would have been keen to become farmers. The problem is that this is based on the same hindsight that makes us wonder what people did without clocks or phones. They did fine. Modern groups of hunters and gatherers are in no hurry to start to farm, and the same was probably true in the Neolithic period. People didn't feel themselves to be lacking in some way, subject to a void that could only be filled by farming and herding. So, what happened? Can the origin of agriculture even be called an invention? Or was it a process that carried people along? What can archaeology tell us? We now know that early settlements were clearly built before the domestication of plants and animals. That's not what scholars originally thought. People didn't settle because farming allowed them to. They settled first, and then later, maybe 3,000 years later, they started to farm. Furthermore, the men and women who first started building settlements weren't the cavemen of cartoons. They were fully modern humans. If you could have frozen an embryo of an early settler for 12,000 years, he or she would grow up completely unremarkable in the modern world. No doubt texting on a smartphone, struggling to get good grades in college, and going out with friends after work. The first settlers were anatomically and intellectually modern, and they had languages that were probably just as sophisticated and expressive as modern languages are. People tend to think that language was invented when writing was, but writing came thousands and thousands of years after people had begun to talk. So the early settlers could communicate easily with one another about their lives and concerns. They just didn't have our technology. In the same way, the early settlers had already been gathering grains for millennia, and of course they must have known that plants grew from seeds. Hunting and gathering simply worked well, so they didn't need to plant their seeds to make their own food. What is a surprise is that modern hunters and gatherers have a lot more leisure time than the farmers who use the simple technologies available to them. For example, hunters and gatherers known as the Kalahari Bushmen, who today live in a vast expanse in southern Africa, spent only about 12 to 19 hours a week collecting their food, according to one well-documented study. whereas neighboring farmers worked for at least 14 more hours a week to feed themselves. Farming is tough. Crops can fail. There are pests and diseases to worry about. One has to sow seeds, weed the fields, tend the crops, possibly water the crops if rainfall is scarce, and then harvest them. And once the harvest is in, how do you protect your food from yet more pests or mold or damp? Hunting and gathering, in comparison, is all about harvesting, leaving nature to take care of the rest. The 20th century Kalahari hunters and gatherers ate about 75 different wild plants, so they had a wide selection to draw from, and they wouldn't starve if one or even several plants suffered from a pest or was unavailable. Skeletal evidence also shows that early farmers were shorter and sicker than hunters and gatherers who came before them. Hunters and gatherers in pre-Neolithic Greece and Turkey was similar in height to modern men and women, an average of 5'9" for the men and 5'3" for the women. Once they started to farm, though, they got a lot shorter. By 3000 BCE, the men in the same region averaged 5'3" and the women 5 foot. This could be because farmers' diets were more restricted than the diets of hunters and gatherers, and farmers ate a lot more bread and a lot less meat than hunters did. Early farmers also had much worse teeth. Since wheat and barley need to be ground into flour to become edible, the grit from the grindstones got in their food and it wore down their teeth. Women, who spent hours and hours every day kneeling to grind the grain, wound up with toe bones permanently fused into a crouching position. Given all these disadvantages, who would choose to farm? Some of the most popular theories suggest that humans were forced into farming, that it wasn't a choice at all. The earliest hunting and gathering settlements were located near abundant natural resources. Ideally, these included a spring or river that provided drinking water and attracted animals, as well as a source of flint for stone tools and a naturally occurring meadow full of barley or wheat. This is known as a stand of barley or wheat. Once a year, when the wild grain was ripe, it would have been harvested. In a famous experiment, a 20th century American archaeologist named Jack Harlan made a Neolithic-style sickle and harvested grain from a stand of wild einkorn wheat in Turkey. He was able to collect about 1 kilogram of clean grain, that is, about 2.2 pounds, every hour. Given the amount of wild grain that was growing in the region during the Neolithic period, Harlan estimated that a family of 4 could have harvested a metric ton of wheat over the course of 3 weeks. And since grain doesn't rot the way that fruits and vegetables do, this could have fed the family for a whole year. The problem was that huge amounts of grain couldn't be carried around. It needed to be stored somewhere. And once the grain was stored, there must have been a strong motivation to stay near it. This might be the original logic behind settling in one place. If that place provided food year-round, there was no need to keep following herds or to travel from place to place. A permanent shelter could be constructed, and heavy objects, such as grinding stones for processing the grain, could be kept there. The population probably grew as a result. Women could have their babies closer together because they didn't have to carry their infants around. These early settlers weren't farming, but they were starting to live with some of the disadvantages of farming that I mentioned a moment ago. They had started to depend on fewer plants for most of their calories, especially grains, so their diets were more limited and their teeth began to suffer. They had to devote time and attention to protecting the grain that they'd harvested, even though it was wild. And if a disease or drought affected their wild stand of grain and their harvest was smaller than usual, they faced a bigger problem than before. More than 14,000 years ago, in a region that includes parts of modern Israel, Lebanon, and Jordan, people belonging to what we call the Natufian culture lived just this way, living in built shelters and making the best use of the resources in their region. The area where the Natufians settled got plenty of rainfall, and was where you'd find the wild ancestors of modern wheat, barley, rye, peas, lentils, sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle. In some ways, they were really lucky. They had more than just the makings of a healthy diet, they also had access to a group of species that they would end up being able to manipulate. Not many animals are particularly suited to domestication. For example, zebra don't like to be ridden, and gazelles don't follow one another in herds. So in some parts of the world, no amount of human intervention would have succeeded at domestication. The animals would have stayed just as uncontrollable as before. But in the eastern Mediterranean area, known as the Levant, domestication wasn't a problem. Wild sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle were particularly domesticable. That lay far in the future, however. We're looking at the world in about 12,500 BCE. Excavations from Natufian sites show us that these people created houses by digging circular pits and building walls of stone or wood and roofing them with reeds or hides. Smaller pits dug near the houses were lined with limestone, and they allowed the early settlers to store food, such as wild wheat and barley, for long periods of time. As many as 100 people lived near one another in villages made up of these round houses. Besides benefiting from the wild grains that grew in the area, villagers also hunted birds and gazelle. Vast amounts of gazelle bones have been found at some of the Natufian sites. There seems to have been plenty to eat. In order to hunt and to harvest wild plants, the people developed complex and beautiful stone tools. This was long before anyone thought up the technology necessary to make metal tools. The Natufians hadn't even invented pottery yet. They had fire, they cooked over it, and they used it for protection and for warmth. But its potential was still relatively unharnessed. So, all man-made objects had to be shaped by hand, and this was an exacting and time-consuming process, one that none of us today could master without years of training. The stone workers made tiny flint blades 1 to 3 centimeters long, with perfectly straight edges for slicing or fine serrations for cutting. These are known as microliths, and they would have been fitted into bone hafts or handles to make sickles, arrows, and knives. Each shape of blade had a specific purpose. A stone cutter holding a nodule of flint would have looked at it with an expert eye, seeing exactly where he would be able to coax a particular shape of blade out of its core by hitting it at just the right angle. Other types of stone were ground into larger shapes, such as mortars, pestles, and bowls of various kinds. The Natufian people also made bone tools, such as hooks for fishing. Fish was important to their diet as well, and they made needles for weaving. The baskets, mats, and fabrics they wove have long since disintegrated, as all organic materials do in a humid environment. But it's likely that women and men developed advanced skills in these areas. Some of us might think of ourselves as much more sophisticated than the Natufian villagers, but how many of us could weave a basket? Beads were popular too, especially beads made from seashells, and these were strung into necklaces, bracelets, and headdresses. All of this was possible without farming, because the climate was kind and natural resources were abundant. The people might even have had some sort of belief in a life after death. We can guess this because they buried their loved ones in cemeteries near their settlements, accompanied by flowers and sometimes dogs. Wolves were domesticated to become dogs right around this time. One dramatic Natufian burial, in a pit inside a cave in Israel, included the body of a 45-year-old woman who was buried with all sorts of surprising things. 50 tortoise shells, the tail of a wild cow, the pelvis of a leopard, the wing bone of an eagle, the forearm of a wild boar, a stone bowl, and a severed human foot, a foot much larger than her own. A ring of stone surrounded her grave and separated it from 27 others. The excavator concluded she was probably a shaman, someone who practiced healing and was viewed as holy in some way. Shamans probably were effective in their practice. What we now think of as the placebo effect would have worked well then too. People who believe they will get well often do. Their bodies rally to fight off infection. The shamans might also have found cures for pain or illness among the many plants available to them. All in all, life in a Natufian village probably seemed pretty good. At least for the first couple of thousand years, food and water were plentiful, and men and women developed sophisticated skills in making tools, buildings, clothes, and baskets. They had children who grew up and had children of their own. They could defend themselves against wild animals and protect themselves from the elements. They probably told stories in the evenings, and being human, they sang songs. This must have seemed to be the way that life had always been and always would continue to be. So why did these people, sometimes in the very same villages where they had lived as hunters and gatherers, begin to farm? The fact that they did so is clear. A few thousand years later, the distinctly transformed shapes of domesticated grains, pulses like lentils and peas, and animals show that these species had become dependent on humans for their existence. Farmers gradually chose and bred plants with bigger seeds, sheep with longer wool, and so on. Some scholars think this was an unconscious process. They call it unconscious selection. They believe that farmers didn't set out to plant larger grains that would produce more food, but instead, various attributes of the grains and animals was selected for by natural processes that resulted from harvesting wild foods and taking care of young animals. Other scholars point out just how much modern hunters and gatherers know about their foods, including, for example, how to make poisonous plants edible through cooking and other processing. They think that the same could have been true in ancient times. In that case, domestication could have been quite conscious. These were smart men and women who observed new mutations of plants that occurred naturally and took advantage of them. Unfortunately, for those of us asking these questions today, the physical changes that mark plants and animals as domesticated took place a long time after domestication started, so it's not possible to mark an exact date when the process began. One popular theory as to why people started to farm is that they were spurred to do so by changing climate. Around 11,000 years ago, the weather in the Near East got colder and drier than it had been. The plants and animals that had reliably appeared in the past, simply needing to be gathered up or hunted, became scarcer. Some communities gave up and moved. Others clung on, perhaps supplementing their diets by beginning to plant the foods that they depended on, or by keeping young animals that would grow and be useful to them. Some of the animals that were native to this area had temperaments that lent themselves to being herded, sheep, goats, and cattle, for example. The process was extremely gradual, according to this theory. Although the domestication of plants and animals is often referred to as the agricultural revolution, it happened so slowly that it was probably invisible to the people living through it. Another theory is that settlements themselves caused the problem that ended up being solved, to some extent anyway, by domestication. The villagers had always focused their attention on the immediate area, which created environmental stress. Intense foraging and hunting destabilized the natural environment. In this case, a small trigger could suddenly limit resources dramatically. This could be a sudden increase in plant pests, for example, or a change in the movement patterns of gazelle, or a swarm of locusts. Farming and herding would have helped protect the villagers against these disasters. Or perhaps, according to yet another theory, the Natufian villagers were so successful that they grew too numerous for their local environments. The growing population couldn't be supported by continuing to hunt and gather in the immediate vicinity, so they might have started farming right where they lived in order to increase the food supply. By the way, An earlier generation of scholars hypothesized that a population increase forced people out of the central zone where the plants and animals were present. They proposed that these migrant populations then moved into marginal zones and brought the plants and animals with them, farming and herding in a region where it was not possible to hunt and gather. It's a nice theory, and it was popular when I was in grad school. But archaeologists have proved it wrong. Farming doesn't seem to have originated in these marginal zones at all. Instead, it began right around where the earlier villages first settled. A combination of theories is also possible. Perhaps climate change added to the stress on a population that had grown too large for the resources available and had already been subject to destabilization because of the overutilization of the natural resources. A very recent theory about domestication, put forward by the Israeli archaeologist Avi Gofer and the agronomist Shahal Abo, rejects the idea that the transition from hunting and gathering to farming was slow. They think it was well planned and happened surprisingly fast, in one place. Their theory holds the proto-farmers were conscious that they had selected particular seeds to plant, the very seeds that were most likely to sprout. These same proto-farmers focused on 6 species at the same time: barley, 2 types of wheat, flax, lentils, and chickpeas. In this view, they were wise planners, men and women who knew they needed the plants to be more productive than was true in the wild, and who bred them precisely for this purpose. Aside from this theory, however, it has been unpopular for quite a while to talk about the invention of farming and herding. The emphasis has been on a long process, with incremental steps along the way, that ultimately resulted in a totally different lifestyle. Most scholars believe that people didn't choose to be farmers. Who would choose that, given the disadvantages? Instead, over thousands of years, they came to depend more on the foods that they nurtured themselves and less on the foods that they gathered in the wild. No one would have any recollection of what it was like to be a pure hunter-gatherer by the time they were totally dependent on farming. And even then, they still hunted and gathered. In a way, we still do. If you go fishing, or if you gather and eat blackberries in late summer from wild bushes, or if you search for mushrooms in the forest, you're keeping a little bit of that hunting and gathering heritage alive. For now, it's impossible to know which of the many theories about the origins of the domestication of plants and animals is correct. Scholars disagree. One remarkable piece of recent evidence, though, has shaken up our image of the hunters and gatherers in the Near East. It turns out they were not only intelligent, but also organized and passionate about their beliefs, in a way that was completely hidden before. The discovery is at a site called Gobekli Tepe in southeast Turkey. About 12,000 years ago, long before farming, when humans were just beginning to settle in hunting and gathering communities, a group of people erected a monument at Gobekli Tepe to their gods. It consisted of huge circles of standing stones. One of the circles is 65 feet across, and the largest of the stones weighs 16 tons. These stones are T-shaped and engraved with images of predatory and poisonous animals. The engravings are not of the prey the people of this time hunted. There are no images of gazelle or sheep or goats. Instead, they carved lions, scorpions, vultures, snakes, and foxes. There doesn't seem to have been a settlement nearby, but according to the excavators, hundreds of people must have been involved in the construction. They had to quarry the stones, drag them into position, and stand them upright. Then they engraved the images and built the walls. This took organization. Someone was in charge. The project must also have required food and water for the workers, and perhaps shelter. Klaus Schmidt, a German archaeologist who directed the excavation, proposed yet another reason for the development of agriculture. He theorized that perhaps, in order to feed the workmen on this project, it was not enough to hunt and gather. They needed a more reliable source of large amounts of food. Perhaps they grew it themselves. We also have to wonder, why was this monument built? Were these the images of the gods whom the hunters and gatherers feared? Were they attempting to control natural dangers by erecting images of them? Did they bury the dead nearby? It's a mystery. Nobody invented writing for another 7,000 years after Gobekli Tepe was built, so the people of this era had no way to tell us. People certainly must have visited the site after it was built, perhaps traveling from hundreds of miles away. There's archaeological evidence of feasts taking place, huge stone bowls that would have held 40 gallons of liquid, beer maybe, and giant piles of animal bones. Visitors must have met others, shared ideas, and perhaps worshipped together. It seems that religious beliefs were already a powerful force on human behavior, even before pottery, before farming, before almost anything we define as civilization. To sum up, farming and herding completely changed the course of human history, but they didn't necessarily present an obvious advantage to the first farmers. Farming also developed independently in China, the New World, Africa, and other regions. And in each case, it was probably a lengthy process, all but invisible to each subsequent generation. People probably thought they were doing things just the same way they always had. But after 3,000 years of very slow change, once agriculture dominated the economy, things began to change more quickly. The Neolithic, or New Stone Age, which lasted from about 9,000 to 5,000 BCE, got its name partly from the sophistication of the stone tools the people were using. Humans had begun to plant seeds and herd animals, and they were becoming farmers. Dependence on agriculture and herded animals had developed even earlier, throughout the pre-Neolithic period, and now there was really no turning back. People still fished, hunted for birds, and gathered some plants, but the bulk of their diet came from farming. The evidence for this comes from seeds and bones found at archaeological sites. Domestication changed the species slightly. Shapes of seeds and of horn cores tell us that the plants and animals were controlled by humans. They weren't wild anymore. Farming became common throughout northern Mesopotamia and the Levant, where enough rain fell. This was still before the invention of pottery, in an era known as the pre-pottery Neolithic. One remarkable discovery from the period comes from the site of Jericho. This Neolithic community of about 300 people was built in the desert next to a gushing spring, which made life possible there. The inhabitants were able to devise ways to water their crops, as well as to use the water for drinking and washing. They even built a stone wall around their town that was 9 feet thick and 12 feet high. The Neolithic villagers also built a large stone tower, about 28 feet high and 21 feet across the top, with a staircase inside. There is nothing like it anywhere else from this period, and it has mystified archaeologists and historians. Was it a defensive tower to protect the community? Was it for ceremonial purposes? Was it a lookout platform to protect the spring? Perhaps the wall was needed to defend stores of grain from raiding neighbors, though some scholars think it was protection against flooding. No matter why these structures were built, they must have taken considerable planning and effort, and a lot of manpower. People must have felt that the buildings were important. Stable and somewhat larger communities like this one developed new technologies, and surprisingly extensive contacts between communities spread the new technologies widely. So, when something new was invented, a new style of stone tool for example, we can see that the ideas spread, by the fact that examples of these same types of tools are found in archaeological sites distributed over hundreds of square miles. Sometimes, when I'm hiking in the countryside near my home, I think about those ancient people whose only way to contact one another over long distances was to head out and walk there. Imagine the hardships they faced, all the bad weather, difficult terrain, and predatory animals. Lions were native to the Near East long after this, even when cities were founded. Traveling would have been difficult and dangerous. So if a type of object is found spread out over a wide area in the Neolithic period, does that mean that people took these objects with them when they walked to some very distant place, maybe hundreds of miles away? A good example is obsidian. Obsidian is a form of naturally occurring glass and is the best possible stone for tools. It has a razor-sharp edge when you break it. Until quite recently, obsidian blades were used in surgery. Obsidian could also be polished to make mirrors, so it was something that lots of people must have wanted, and it's one of the earliest goods to have been traded over long distances. Obsidian from Anatolia, which is now Turkey, has been found at Neolithic sites right across the Near East, and even in the lands around the Aegean Sea, it was obviously very highly valued. Other things were transported far away from their places of origin as well. Seashells are found hundreds of miles from the sea, and marble bracelets were popular in many places. Bitumen from Mesopotamia was also traded across hundreds of miles. Bitumen is a sticky tar substance like asphalt that could be used for waterproofing boats and baskets. It's related to oil. And of course, there's a lot of oil in the Near East. But in ancient times, the only use they had for bitumen was for waterproofing. Some scholars think this amazing evidence of ancient trade doesn't mean that people were actually traveling over long distances. Perhaps dozens of middlemen were involved, each exchanging the obsidian or some other material for something valuable, and the person they traded with then traded it with someone else. Perhaps none of them had any idea of how far the goods had traveled from their places of origin in order to reach them. This seems like a reasonable assumption, that no single person traveled very far, even though the traded goods themselves did. And yet, this assumption might not have been true. The spread of farming gives us some evidence about this. Did people hear about farming and begin to try it? Did they trade the things they needed in order to farm the sheep, goats, cattle, barley, and wheat, one village at a time, spreading the ideas and the domesticates slowly? Or did farmers move from their homeland in the Near East to places hundreds or thousands of miles away, bringing the technology and domesticates with them? That last idea seemed far-fetched until recently. But DNA studies have shown that 80% of Europeans are descended from ancient Near Eastern farmers. The Europeans are also, of course, descended from indigenous populations who inhabited Europe before farming, and from any number of other groups who migrated into Europe at other times. Any one person could have millions of ancestors. The number varies depending on how much the same families continue to intermarry over time. But the fact that for 80% of Europeans, their DNA includes the DNA of ancient Near Eastern peoples means that farmers traveled in the Neolithic period and settled in new places, bringing their sheep, goats, wheat, and barley with them. The DNA of European cattle shows that they too had a Near Eastern origin. We also know, again from DNA, that millet, which is a grain or cereal crop, spread from as far away as China, coming to Eastern Europe at around the same time. A lot of people were moving around, bringing new technologies, new domesticates, and new ideas with them. So Neolithic people were more mobile than you might have expected. Some of the other technologies that began to develop in the Near East made new use of an old friend of humankind, fire. Hundreds of thousands of years before this, even before modern humans evolved, people's lives had been improved a lot by controlling fire. They used it for protection and warmth and for cooking. But in the Neolithic era, they also started using it to change natural materials like stone and clay into other forms. The first of these was plaster. To make lime plaster, you have to burn limestone, which becomes a powder. Then you add water, spreading or molding the plaster into a desired shape, and letting it dry. The drying process can take a long time, and at the end, the plaster becomes hard and stone-like and resistant to water. The ancient pre-pottery Neolithic people in the Levant discovered this, and they used lime plaster to coat floors and walls. Imagine the improvement over a mud floor. The plaster could be washed and swept and covered with rugs for warmth. Plaster had other uses as well. it could be formed into sculptures, like the human figures found at the site of Ain Ghazal in Jordan. These are half-life size, with painted clothing and hair, and cowrie shells inlaid for the eyes. The Neolithic people in the Near East also used plaster to commemorate the dead. At many sites, archaeologists have found skulls separated from skeletons, with facial features reproduced in plaster, and sometimes with cowrie shells in the eye sockets. Strangely enough, these were often found in houses, right where the people lived and worked. They might have been the skulls of family ancestors, and they can be eerily lifelike. Perhaps the ancestors were worshipped, or perhaps the people believed these dead men and women watched over their families and protected them. It might seem macabre to us, but the Neolithic farmers apparently didn't think so. They also experimented with making containers out of plaster. These are called whiteware. A whiteware vessel is like a stone bowl. If it didn't have to be laboriously carved and ground into shape, it could be molded and left to set. Once dry and solid, it could hold water and other liquids and foods. But it had a problem. It couldn't be used for cooking. Put lime plaster over fire, and the lime reverts to powder. Whiteware wasn't produced for long, and it didn't spread to other regions. It was a good invention, but another one was coming along that was even better. In fact, the invention of whiteware might have even spurred that next invention. What if you could shape a vessel out of a different kind of substance and somehow involve fire in the process and get something more useful? There were, of course, other kinds of containers in early Neolithic times. Archaeologists do find some stone bowls, but they would have taken a long time to make, carving and grinding the stone into shape. And people must have had leather bags, baskets, and nets. The Neolithic people were familiar with clay and mud. They used it to make bricks, which, after being left out in the sun to dry, were hard enough to build a wall with. So, after plaster, the next great fire-related invention was pottery. This was truly revolutionary. Think of all the things you can do with pots. You can drink from them, eat from them, store things in them, including liquids, make them in a vast variety of sizes and shapes, from tiny to coffin-sized, and they did bury people in them. And of course, you can cook in them. Pots are just fine over a flame. They don't break or decompose. Whole new culinary possibilities now opened up to the ancient villagers. People could now make porridge from grain, cooking it over the heat in a pot. And they could make soups and stews. Meat was not just roasted anymore. They also used clay to build beehive-shaped ovens, and they baked flat bread inside. These ovens, which are called tanors, are found in ancient villages and are still used across the Middle East. Initially, in the first half of the 7th millennium BCE, pottery was fairly coarse, including some large storage vessels and small bowls. But quite quickly the technology improved, and the ceramics became what we might consider works of art. People painted patterns on their pots with glazes, so that the patterns were fired right onto the surface. Some designs show stick figures of people and animals, but mostly they were decorated with detailed and meticulous geometric patterns. Pots weren't just useful for the ancient people. They are also really useful for modern archaeologists. Mostly, a broken pot is just trash. But that trash lasts pretty much forever. Unlike organic materials like baskets and bags, potsherds don't decompose, and, unlike metal objects which were invented later, they don't corrode, and they can't be melted down and reused. A potsherd found in the ground today looks almost exactly the same as when it was thrown away thousands of years ago. So, when archaeologists find broken pieces of pottery all over the ground in places where ancient people lived, they can use these potsherds to figure out when a site was occupied. Pottery went through phases, like fashions. Sometimes the fabric of the pot was yellow, sometimes reddish or brown. Sometimes the glazes were shiny, sometimes matte. The shapes changed, as did the thickness of the ceramic walls. A fragment of pottery is as datable as a car design. You wouldn't mistake a 1948 Ford for a 1992 Toyota. Archaeologists have that same eye for pots. They can tell Neolithic pots from later ones and can identify more or less when they were made. So when they find pottery fragments dating to a particular era, they know the site was occupied at that time. Most Neolithic settlements were still small villages, but the villagers began to experiment with new construction techniques. In the 8000s BCE, even before pottery was invented, people had begun to use bricks for construction and built their houses in rectangular shapes. We're so used to rectangular rooms that they don't seem exceptional at all. But initially, they were revolutionary. Square corners allowed more houses to be built next to one another. An extreme case of this is seen in the city of Catalhoyuk in Turkey. Catalhoyuk is a remarkable place, a veritable town of maybe hundreds of inhabitants that thrived around 6000 BCE. That was a time when most other communities were just the size of villages. Chatal had regular, rectangular buildings, all jammed up against one another, without doors, and without streets in between. So you had to enter your house by a ladder from the roof. The ladder was almost always on the south side of the building, for some reason, with the hearth and the oven under the entry hole in the ceiling. This lack of doors and streets might have been good for the town's protection, whether from other people, animals, or the elements. It gets very cold on the Anatolian plateau in the winter, and very hot in the summer, so all those adjacent walls would have served as insulation against the weather extremes. But this also meant that people had to learn how to live peacefully with one another in very close quarters. The walls and floors of the houses in Catalhoyuk were almost all plastered with lime plaster. So were the brick benches that lined some of the walls and the raised platforms that were found in every house. And some of the walls were brightly painted. Some of the rooms in Catalhoyuk had plaster sculptures on the walls in the shapes of the heads of cattle and female figures. The first excavations at Catalhoyuk were directed by James Mellart. Mellart called these rooms shrines, and he thought they had a religious purpose. Professor Ian Hodder, who has worked to excavate Chatal, believes that these pictures and sculpted figures represent a crucial development. People had to overcome their fears of wild animals and death before they could truly domesticate the natural world. By creating artworks that showed things that they feared, and even having them inside their homes, they were able to start to control their environments. Now, remember that these people were just like modern humans in terms of their mental and physical abilities. They didn't have a way to write down their ideas, so we don't know what they were thinking. But we can be sure that they talked unplanned, and that some people came up with exciting new ideas. We can also be sure that they mourned their dead. There were about 480 burials in the small area of Catalhoyuk that has been excavated. Almost all of them are under the platforms in the houses. It looks as though some of the bodies were excarnated before burial. The flesh had been removed. This might have been taken care of by vultures, as shown in the wall paintings. A family's ancestors was safely buried right beneath the floors where their descendants lived and slept. Like earlier people in the Levant, they plastered some of the skulls and painted them red. The people clearly had religious ideas that might have had something to do with the plaster models of bulls and females. And they probably had a belief in an afterlife, and a sense that dead ancestors had some sort of continuing power in the world of the living. But it's impossible to figure out the details. Catalhoyuk had been occupied for centuries before the time of the town that Mellart and Hodder excavated. There are lots of occupation levels below the excavated ones, from time periods before the Neolithic. The people who first settled there probably chose the site because it was close to a river and also near a volcano, where they could pick up obsidian. The people of Catalhoyuk. This is the Sleepless historian, weaving history's whispers for restless nights. Join our journey at Akamasturka, share the calm, subscribe, and drift deeper into the past. Might have been on one end of a trading network, benefiting from the fact that they were able to trade obsidian with other regions. Imported seashells were also found at the site. Even at this early time, when no one seems to have been richer than anyone else, people already seem to have had a desire for beautiful things that weren't available near home. Most of Mesopotamia, that's modern Iraq, was pretty much uninhabited at this time. It's just too hot and dry. Other than at Jericho, which is near the Jordan River, and at a few other isolated places, people could farm only if there was enough rainfall to water their crops. They hadn't yet started digging canals from the local rivers to water their fields that way. Some recent excavations, though, show there were a number of early Neolithic farming settlements in the far south around the Persian Gulf. One theory is that what is now the Persian Gulf wasn't filled with water until about 14,000 years ago. It was a deep valley, and ancient hunters and gatherers lived there in the so-called Gulf Oasis. Then, between 14,000 and 8,000 years ago, sea levels rose and swamped more than 100,000 square kilometers of land with seawater. Even after this inundation, there was still much more dry land around the Gulf than today, and Neolithic villages prospered. The cattle that they herded had local origins, but their sheep had come from further north. Interestingly, this might be where cats were first domesticated. Some scholars think cats domesticated themselves in a way. They were drawn to the rodents that would have populated human settlements, and they began to live comfortably among humans, even though the people who resided there didn't necessarily do anything to encourage them. And cats' personalities haven't changed. They still don't seem to need us all that much, they just grace us with their presence. Around 6000 BCE, farmers began to move south from the foothills into the floodplain of Mesopotamia, as they figured out how to dig irrigation canals to water their crops. The Mesopotamian plain is very flat. It consists of thousands of years of silt laid down by the floods of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This silty soil is rich and fertile when watered, so the irrigated fields would have produced plenty of food. The situation in ancient Egypt was similar, but with some important differences. In Egypt, the annual flood arrived right before the sowing season. As soon as the waters receded, farmers planted their seeds, and the ground was wet enough to need minimal additional irrigation. The land produced abundant crops with little need for human intervention, beyond sowing, tending, and harvesting. Mesopotamian farmers had a much more difficult situation, as they tried to use the river water to irrigate their fields. One difference from Egypt is the Mesopotamian rivers were, in places, higher than the land. This was an advantage in a way. If you breached the natural levee on either side, some of the river water flowed downhill into your fields. It didn't need to be lifted into irrigation canals with buckets. You just needed to be sure to have a way of controlling or stopping the flow when necessary. But when the annual floods came and river waters spilled over the banks, there was no guarantee the river would end up flowing along the same course as before. If your village was near the banks of a river, which almost all of them were so the villagers could use the water for irrigation, you could be out of luck if the river rerouted itself after the flooding receded. Another problem for farmers in Mesopotamia was the flood came at the wrong time of year. Seeds needed to be sowed in the spring, but the flood came in early summer. The floodwaters would have washed away the young plants. So from the start, Mesopotamians who moved into the river valleys needed to find ways to control the rivers, making sure they didn't change course and they didn't flood the fields at the wrong times. This meant the villagers needed to join forces to do some pretty big construction projects, such as reinforcing and raising levees on both banks of the river and protecting fields with dikes and reservoirs. These efforts became a constant feature of Mesopotamian life and meant that communities always had to work together. It was too much labor for one family or even a group of families to manage alone. Some of the earliest communities to spread into central Mesopotamia from the north belonged to the Sumerian culture, which is named after the site of Samarra where their pottery was first identified. Sumerian pottery is very distinctive, with a matte finish, and it's often decorated with drawings of animals and humans in black paint. Sometimes even the necks were shaped with three-dimensional human faces, and eyes shaped like coffee beans stuck on his appliques. These types of pots are found all across central and northern Mesopotamia. They seem to have been valuable trade items. They were even sometimes repaired with bitumen, that sticky tar substance, when the pots broke. The repaired item would not have been very sturdy or useful for cooking, but it must have been treasured by the people who owned it. The Sumerian people also used clay to make figurines, often with those same coffee bean eyes as on some of the pots. Most were of women, who were depicted with necklaces and designs on their bodies that might have represented tattoos. The site of Tel Es-Sawan is probably the best-known Sumerian site. It's in an area that sometimes had enough rainfall for agriculture, but the weather was unreliable. Early farmers were able to use the annual flooding of local streams to supplement the rainfall. Later, they seem to have dug irrigation canals and begun the long Mesopotamian struggle to bring their rivers and streams under control. The buildings at Tel Es-Sawan are surprisingly large and T-shaped, and the exterior walls had some niches and buttresses, which later became characteristic of Mesopotamian architecture. Almost all of these houses were the same size and shape, probably with one dwelling per family. There's no sign that anyone was particularly rich or poor. The population seems to have been fairly equal. But they must have had some sort of village-level organization in order to plan their irrigation activities. The people there grew several kinds of wheat as well as barley. Bones found at the site show they herded sheep and goats, which no doubt provided wool and milk, and they owned cattle. They also still hunted wild gazelle, deer, and boar, and they fished as well. A culture that flourished after the Sumerian, and to the north of it, is known as the Halaf. The Halaf culture flourished across northern Mesopotamia, and even into Syria and southern Anatolia, from around 5700 to 5000 BCE. This whole region has enough rainfall for agriculture, so they didn't need to irrigate their fields. The Halaf people built both round and rectangular houses, and mostly lived in small villages, where they farmed the same crops and herded the same animals that we've come across out everywhere. The thing that stands out most is that the Halaf people made incredibly beautiful ceramics. The pots were handcrafted in elegant shapes with detailed and meticulous designs, and they seem to have been traded far and wide. Or perhaps they were made by potters who moved from town to town. Halaf pots reflect such a high level of craftsmanship that archaeologists believe they must have been made by specialists, people who made pots for a living, rather than your typical farmer. These men, or perhaps women, would have depended on exchanging the pots they made for food. So, by 5000 BCE, the farmers of the Neolithic period had spread right across the Near East, even into areas where they couldn't depend on rainfall to water their crops, and where they needed to irrigate their fields. They also traded with one another over very long distances for valuable goods like seashells for jewelry, bitumen for waterproofing, obsidian for stone tools, and even handmade goods like beautiful pots. A few of the villages grew to the size of towns, such as Jericho and Catalhoyuk, with hundreds of residents. But most communities were still relatively small. And although some people must have specialized in particular crafts, there don't seem to have been any distinctions between rich and poor people yet. But that was about to change. The Mesopotamian people of the Halaf culture lived mostly in small villages in the 6th millennium BCE. They farmed and used simple irrigation canals to water their fields. They herded sheep and goats. They prized exotic goods from far away, things like obsidian and seashells, and used exquisite pottery and fine stone tools made by highly skilled craftsmen. These people probably told stories about the past and about their heroes and gods. But they wrote nothing down, because no one had conceived of writing yet. The only way we know anything about them is from the buildings they abandoned and the objects they left lying around. objects that eventually were covered up by dirt and debris, and that archaeologists could uncover later. By 6000 BCE, some big changes were taking place elsewhere in Mesopotamia, and these continued for the next 2,000 years. This is what archaeologists call the Ubaid culture, named for the site where the culture was first identified in the far south of Mesopotamia. Until the last decades of the 20th century, the Ubaid culture was almost always discussed as a southern Mesopotamian phenomenon. That idea has started to change. But let's begin where the scholars started to understand this period, just to the north of the Persian Gulf, in what is now southern Iraq. One village there was later known as Eridu, and this might already have been its name in 6000 BCE. There's been a community at the site since as early as 8000 BCE. When people first settled around Eridu, it was a swampy area, where the fresh water from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers spread out into marshes, not far from the saltier waters of the Gulf. Until about 12,000 BC, the area was a wide valley. It flooded gradually. The process took about 6,000 years, and by 6000 BCE, the Gulf was at its highest point, stretching considerably further north than today. It used to be thought that towns in this region started to grow because people discovered how to dig and manage large irrigation canals. The logic held that with these canals, fields became more productive, which fed larger populations, requiring a larger workforce to build bigger canals, which in turn brought more fields into cultivation and allowed for even larger populations, and so on. But a number of researchers have turned this theory on its head. They think that extensive farming was made possible by the water already in the swampy soil, and that this gave rise to larger communities than had been possible anywhere else. In this view, only when the wetlands began to dry out did the people have to find some other way to keep their fields productive, so as to feed the large numbers of people who were already living in the new towns. At that point, communities would have turned to irrigation. The creation of the canals must have taken a lot of thought and effort. Canals had to be cleaned to keep them free from silt. They had to be higher than the surrounding fields, so that gravity would feed the water into smaller canals out in the fields. The people needed ways to effectively keep the water in check when it wasn't needed, and ways to prevent it from gushing out too fast and destroying crops when it was needed. They had to dig reservoirs and build levees. No doubt the people of Eridu and other southern towns made plenty of mistakes along the way, but eventually they figured it out. There must have been some people in charge who called out workers to help with the construction and maintenance of the canals, and there must have been a way to compensate those workers for their time. This type of organization wasn't new for humans. Thousands of years earlier, at Gobekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, hundreds of Neolithic workers joined forces to build a stone temple. At Eridu, though, the workers lived in a local community year-round, and the farms around the settlement supported bigger families. It's pretty amazing that they were able to create this type of organization without a writing system. So, Eridu must have been an attractive place to live. It had plenty of fields and food, and there was another benefit to living in Eridu too. It was home to a major god. Perhaps people felt safer knowing that this god was right there in the community with them. At the beginning of the Ubaid period, when Eridu was still a small community, the shrine to this god was modest, just a square brick room with an altar at the end and an offering stand in the middle. Over time, as the town got bigger, the temple was rebuilt on an ever grander and more impressive scale, but always on exactly the same sacred spot. Fish bones on the altar suggest that right from earliest times, the shrine was dedicated to the god of sweet water. It's likely this was true because for thousands of years, Eridu continued to be the home of this god, whose name was Enki. Monumental architecture such as this temple was one of the remarkable features of the growing towns of the Ubaid period. Eridu wasn't the only town with a large temple in its center, and these temples had certain features that continued down through many subsequent centuries of Mesopotamian history. One feature was that the temples continued to be rebuilt in the same place over and over again. As a result, the older walls and floors came to be encased in a platform under the latest version of the temple. Another feature was that the temples were built on what we call a tripartite plan, which included a courtyard with an altar where offerings were burned. And near it, there would be a holy room that housed a statue of the god who owned the temple. Maybe the most striking feature of these early temples to an ancient viewer would have been their exterior walls. They were decorated with brick buttresses, which created shadows in the sunshine and gave the structures the appearance of having vertical stripes. Archaeologists often refer to this as a niche and buttress facade. It was a hallmark of Mesopotamian temple architecture. The buildings were not designed haphazardly. We know this because an analysis of the ground plans of the temples shows that the Ubaid period had a standard measurement. It's been called an Ubaid cubit that measured 72 centimeters or about 28 inches. The designer of a building laid out the exterior wall in these 72 centimeter increments, just as we use inches and feet or centimeters and meters. Remember that they had no writing yet, but they were already thinking of the abstract geometry of a structure before it was built. Let's go back to the temple honoring the god Enki. You can imagine how important Enki was to the people living in the southern part of Mesopotamia. The water that he provided came up from the ground and flowed in the rivers. This water was precious to them. They needed it for their crops and for drinking and bathing. Everything about it was good. It's not surprising that Enki was the one god who always watched out for humans. Even when other gods were causing all kinds of problems, Enki would have human interests at heart. Or at least that's what the later Mesopotamians believed. We can't be sure about religion during the Ubaid period, but there was no major break between the Ubaid people and the people who would later develop writing, so they probably had similar beliefs. Anyway, there was Eridu, home to the beloved god Enki and his ever more beautiful temple, surrounded by lush fields that must have seemed like a miracle in the dry south. And the community had a thriving, growing population. The men who lived there would have been called up not just to keep expanding the canal system, but also to build each new iteration of the temple. No doubt the area became a magnet to merchants and traveling craftsmen who brought goods from distant places. That's because it was home to a captive audience of buyers for their goods, and this would make it even more attractive as a place to live. So it began to look less like a village and more like what we would recognize as a town, though still with only perhaps 3,000 inhabitants. Houses in Ubaid period communities like Eridu began to vary in size. Some were bigger than others. Some graves were richer than others as well. And even babies were sometimes buried with luxury gifts. A rich burial for a baby suggests that its family might have been wealthy, wealthier perhaps than others. These are early hints of social stratification. Some people were clearly richer than others. Any number of causes could have been behind this. Some fields produced abundant crops because they were closest to the canals. If you owned one of these fields, you might have been better off than someone with a more distant field. Some craftsmen made better textiles or better pots or better beads, and perhaps were able to bargain for more goods in exchange. Some people began to wield more power, perhaps because they were serving as foremen on the construction projects, or as priests or priestesses of the gods. Perhaps the religious leaders had access to the food gifts that were dedicated to the gods. This was presumably after the gods had taken their portions, though since they were statues, they wouldn't have been able to eat the food given to them in the usual way. The gods somehow absorbed the essence of the food. Its smell, perhaps, and the priests shared what was left. To our eyes, that would be the whole offering, and they believed that the gods really got their food first this way. More technological advances accompanied the growth of towns. One was in the use of copper. Almost all the copper that we use today has been smelted from ore, which are rocks that look nothing like copper. My daughter did a science fair project in 6th grade to try to smelt copper. With her dad's help, she took a nondescript stone, malachite, and heated it to a very high temperature in a little kiln that they put together in the barbecue, using an air gun to make the coals as hot as possible. And at the end, she produced just a few specks of bright metal. Honestly, it's just so unlikely. You could see why ancient people would have taken a long time to discover this. Why would a rock produce a metal? Why would you think to try to burn it up to find out? But some copper, like some gold, is found in a metallic form in nature, and you don't have to smelt it. Just imagine how magical this substance must have seemed if you found it lying there. Almost nothing else in nature shines like copper or gold. And when you take a hammer to this lump of native copper, it doesn't fracture into tiny pieces the way the rock does. It bends. You could make it into shapes like beads or pendants. Of course, copper isn't found in southern Mesopotamia. It had to come from a great distance, from what is now Turkey in the north, or from Oman in the south. But it was imported this early, and it's found in Ubaid period sites like Eridu, and was used as jewelry. The metalworkers seem to have discovered that native copper became brittle the more you pounded it, and that it became more flexible again when heated in the fire. This is called annealing. It's a long way from smelting copper out of ore, but perhaps it got them thinking about how fire might transform other materials, just as it transformed limestone into lime to make plaster, and as it transformed soft, pliable clay into hard pottery. The Ubaid people used clay for a lot of things, not just pottery and bricks. They formed clay into crescent shapes, baked it hard to give it a sharp edge, and used the resulting object as a clay sickle for cutting grain. They also formed clay into balls, baked them hard, kept these balls in piles, and used them in slingshots as weapons. We don't know whether they had any sort of organized military force yet, but slingshots would have been useful if your town was attacked. And speaking of clay, the pottery in the Ubaid period was quite distinctive. This is helpful to scholars because it allows us to know if a site was occupied or how to date a level within a site. You see a layer of Ubaid sherds, or pottery fragments, and you know. The pots weren't as fine or delicate as earlier Halaf ceramics had been, but they are attractive. Shallow bowls were popular. They were pale with a dark band around the rim. Ubaid pots of all shapes often had dark geometric patterns. Also, for the first time, potters began to mark their pots with special designs that might be potter's marks, almost like a signature that a potter could use to claim that a pot was his or her own work. And here's the remarkable thing. Ubaid-style pottery is found all over the Near East, from Turkey in the west to Iran in the east, and as far south as southeastern Arabia, in what is now the United Arab Emirates. Ubaid pots spread over thousands of miles. As with so many dramatic changes in ancient history, sometimes it's hard for us today to get excited about such things. In the modern world, you can go to Starbucks in Los Angeles or Paris or Rio de Janeiro. In the same way, you can buy exactly the same style of mug or plate pretty much anywhere in the world. And this doesn't seem especially remarkable. We take it for granted that objects and ideas are transported over vast regions. But in 4000 BCE, things were completely different. Everything from this period that appears far from its point of origin had to be carried over land or sea and passed from one person to another. It's not that the Ubaid people built an empire and brought their pots with them. Instead, a whole group of innovations seem to have spread as a result of interactions between people who were traveling further afield than before. These cultural interactions created even more complexity in the societies that were in touch with one another. Let's look at connections to the south, the region of the Persian Gulf. In Kuwait, archaeologists have found the very earliest remains of a boat, the earliest anywhere in the world. What they found was slabs of bitumen encrusted with barnacles, and with impressions from reed bundles and ropes. The barnacles show that the bitumen coated something that spent a lot of time in the water, which was almost certainly a boat. And the reeds and ropes show how the boat was constructed. Boats like these were used to sail south from Mesopotamia to areas around the Persian Gulf. The Mesopotamians would have encountered other people already living there, who had their own cultures, architecture, their own ways of life. A site called Bakra in Kuwait shows a lot of influence from the Ubaid people of southern Mesopotamia. The buildings were even similar. Some archaeologists think that perhaps people moved there from Mesopotamia. Others believe that the local people admired and imitated Mesopotamian culture, including its architecture. Another site, called Wadi Debayan, further south than what is now Qatar, has Ubaid pottery, along with some other remarkable imports, including obsidian that came all the way from the Taurus Mountains in Turkey. But it wasn't just these two places. Excavators have found Ubaid pottery at about 60 archaeological sites in the Arabian Peninsula. The pottery seems to have been a luxury, and local people in Arabia didn't just import these pots, they made local copies as well. What would have inspired someone from, say, Eridu to invest in building a boat, load it up with Ubaid pots, and perhaps also with locally made textiles, and then head off on what was certainly a treacherous trip across the sea, journeying hundreds of miles to a foreign and potentially hostile land? Perhaps they were already interested in goods that came from this region. Later traders brought pearls, shells, copper, incense, and diorite stone from the lands around the Gulf, and this might already have been true. Some archaeologists suggest the Ubaid people purchased fish there to take back with them, but that seems unlikely, though the earliest travelers there may have been fishermen using nets to get their own fish. Archaeologists have found that the Ubaid people of southern Mesopotamia also had contact with regions hundreds of miles to the north of them. Here, though, the culture seems in some ways to have been even more sophisticated than in the southern region where the Ubaid culture was first discovered. This was not a provincial area. Let me tell you about some of the sites so you see what I mean. Tepe Garwa is near Nineveh, outside modern-day Mosul in northern Iraq. Long after this, in the 7th century BCE, you're tuned to the Sleepless historian, where time's secrets unfold in quiet tones. Like, share, and let history cradle you to sleep. Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. Tepe Garwa was excavated in the mid-20th century, and archaeologists working there could see right away how closely it was related to the Ubaid culture. Its monumental buildings were constructed with the same design as in the south, with external niches and buttresses and a tripartite form. And we know now that the builders at Tepe Garwa even used the same standard Ubaid cubit of 72 centimeters in their design and construction. People there used the same type of pottery as well. The town at Tepe Garwa was much smaller than Eridu, but it had a cemetery that showed the same growing divisions in wealth that you find in the south. There were gold rosettes and gold studs in some of the tombs. One tomb contained an extraordinary wolf's head vessel made from electrum, which is a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver. And there were ground stone bowls made of obsidian. All of these materials, gold, electrum, and obsidian, had to be imported from far away. Anyone who could take these types of luxury goods to the afterlife with him or her was someone with power. 3 sites in Syria, far to the west of Tepe Garwa and far to the north of Eridu, have given us even more evidence for this period. One is Tel Zaydan, another is Tel Brak, and the third is Tel Hammukar. Tel Zaydan is the furthest to the west, on the east bank of the Balik River. The other two, Brak and Hammukar, are in the region known as the Habor Triangle. This is in northern Syria, near what is now the Turkish border. A lot of small rivers flow south across the wide triangular region, joining together to form the Habor River, which flows south to the Euphrates. The Habor Triangle extends about 100 miles from west to east. It gets enough rainfall for agriculture, but the rivers provide added irrigation water when needed, so it's always been a rich, productive area. All 3 sites were occupied during the Ubaid period and have Ubaid-style pottery and architecture. But they weren't dependent on the south for inspiration. Tel Zaydan, for instance, has some of the earliest evidence of copper smelting. This set the stage for the enormously important development of bronze. Copper is too soft for weapons and for most tools, but once you smelt copper from ore, rather than just hammering native copper into shape, it's a much smaller step to add arsenic to the mix to make a harder metal called arsenic bronze. Later, arsenic was replaced with tin. Tin was more difficult to obtain because it came from further away, but unlike arsenic, it wasn't toxic when you smelted it. By 5000 BCE, the people of Tel Zaydan had built a big wall around their settlement. The town grew to be as large as Eridu, 30 acres. That's about the size of 5.5 city blocks in New York City. Zaydan is estimated to also have had about the same population as Eridu, 3,000 inhabitants. This sounds quite small to us today, but it was immeasurably bigger and more complex than the villages that had preceded it. Two other finds from Zaydan give us a sense of this complexity. One is the discovery of 8 large kilns for firing pottery. This was not a household-level craft. Instead, these were probably owned by a town institution, perhaps the temple, for firing very large quantities of pots. Again, we can marvel at the organization that this must have involved. Even more notable was the discovery of stamp seals and sealings. These weren't used in the south yet, but were found at Tel Zaydan, Tel Brak, and Tel Hammukar. Each seal probably was used by an important person and was stamped into lumps of clay to seal goods or doorways. A sealed doorway wasn't necessarily locked, but it couldn't be opened without breaking the seal, so people would know that someone had been in the room. A pot with a sealed stopper was safe from pilfering fingers because a broken seal wouldn't go unnoticed. Each seal was carved with a design that would have identified it as belonging to a particular person. Seals of this kind are found as early as 7000 BCE in the north, but they were unknown at this point in the south, so perhaps the towns of the north had more complex administrations and hierarchies. Luxury goods came to these northern sites through trade. The people were importing copper and obsidian from Anatolia, and bitumen from Iraq. A particularly fine example of an object made from imported materials was found at Tel Brak. It came from a context that the excavators date to around 4000 BCE, towards the end of the Ubaid period. They called it a chalice because of its tall, elegant, fluted shape. It had black obsidian cup on a white marble base, with the two pieces cemented together with the sticky tar substance bitumen. Bitumen at the top might have cemented a gold inlay into a groove, but the gold, if that's what it was missing by the time the excavators recovered the chalice. It's an example of a very high level of workmanship. In contrast, a lot of the pots and plates found at Tel Brak were crudely made. The excavators see this as clear evidence of social stratification. Tel Hammukar was smaller than Tel Zaydan and the southern towns, but it had a wall around it, and monumental buildings, along with those all-important stamp seals. A few of the seals, used at both Hammukar and Brak, were decorated with images of lions. The carving of these lions is stunning. One example from Tel Brak is an impression of a seal that's barely 2 inches across, but manages to convey the power and majesty of the lion, with even the muscles in its legs and details of its muzzle represented. Curiously, it seems to have hooks on its paws like a bird. Lions could be found in the wild in Syria, and the lion was probably already seen as the king of the beasts, because of its ferocity and speed. Later in Mesopotamian history, lions came to symbolize royalty, so it's tempting to imagine these as royal seals, but we should be cautious before jumping to conclusions. There's no other evidence for kings this early. Still, someone had enough power to use the lion as the symbol on his stamp seal, and to employ a craftsman of extraordinary talent. It's interesting to wonder how much of our conception of southern Mesopotamia as the cradle of civilization comes from the fact that southern sites like Eridu were excavated first. If the Ubaid period towns of Syria had been found before them, we would think of the Ubaid culture as a northern development that spread to the south perhaps, rather than the other way around. It does seem true that the idea of using seals to signify ownership or control was a northern innovation, and that copper smelting developed earlier in the north than the south. On the other hand, the next big development in the history of the region, and of the world for that matter, originated in southern Mesopotamia without a doubt. It's not that anyone invaded or introduced a new culture, but during the years from 3800 to 3000 BCE, the southern Mesopotamian people positively exploded with innovations, while their largest city, Uruk, grew to perhaps 10 times the size of the towns of the Ubaid period. This period, starting with the Ubaid period and continuing into the Uruk period, is sometimes referred to as the Urban Revolution. Like the agricultural revolution thousands of years before, it marks a turning point for humankind. Once people started living in cities, the idea of the city never went away. Individual cities might be abandoned, whole areas might go back to a rural way of life, but there were still cities flourishing elsewhere, and they have been ever since. Think about all the time that has passed since urban civilization began more than 5,500 years ago. It sounds like an eternity. Historians who specialize in the United States investigate and write about people who lived maybe 100 or 200 years ago. Colleagues in medieval studies might analyze documents from 600 or 700 years ago. 5,500 years is on a different scale altogether. Fellow historians often view my field as impossibly distant in time. But you can look at it another way. I thought about this when my son was born. His birth coincided with the death of the comedian George Burns. It's amazing to my son that his life overlapped that of someone who was born in 1896, just 10 years after the German engineer Carl Benz patented the first gasoline-powered vehicle and before the invention of the airplane, before houses had electricity or telephones, and before most of them had indoor bathrooms. Grover Cleveland was the president, and some veterans of the War of 1812 were still alive. And you can go back the same way to another centenarian. George Burns's life overlapped with that of a man named Colm de Baylis, who lived to the grand old age of 109. By the time he died, young George Burns was 10 years old. De Baylis was an Irish poet who was born in 1796, when George Washington was still president. So, the slightly overlapping lives of just 3 people take us back to the reign of Louis XIV. Add one more 100-year lifetime, and we're in 1596, with Shakespeare writing his early plays, and another just 5 lifetimes ago, and Columbus was returning to Spain after his second voyage to the New World. You can keep this up, going back one centenarian after another. Just 55 long lives, back to back, take us to the very beginning of cities. Even if you measure in the normal way, using parent-child generations, it's only about 200 of them from this moment now, right to the dawn of civilization. As a comparison, we're separated from the earliest humans by hundreds of thousands of generations. So, 200 generations since the start of civilization is not very long at all. We're babies at this business of civilization, if you look at it that way. We're living right at the beginning of history. Always supposing we humans manage not to destroy the planet or make our species extinct. We could survive as long as our pre-modern human ancestors did, millions of years. From that perspective, not only are we just getting started, but in relative terms, the Mesopotamians built their first cities pretty much yesterday. Think of all the things that we still have around us that started in ancient times. We live in rectangular houses made of natural materials like brick and wood, just as they did. Our houses are arranged on streets, with front doors, and with specialized rooms for socializing, sleeping, and bathing, just like theirs. We marry and have children and worry about disease, just like them. We obey laws, go to court if laws are broken. Our governments recruit armies, who fight their enemies to the death in battle. We send diplomats to negotiate peace treaties. We worship gods, we bury our dead, we grow crops on farms, and we herd the same animals. We wear clothes made of animal products, wool and leather, and plant products, cotton and linen. To communicate, we use our hands to write with implements on natural materials, paper in our case, clay in the example of our predecessors. We tell stories and sing songs. In a great many ways, we still live like the Mesopotamians. This was even more true just 150 years ago, before modern medicine and electricity, cars, airplanes, computers, the internet, and so on. But even now, we are not that far removed from the kind of life that Mesopotamian people led. from about 3800 BCE to 3100 BCE, right when cities were getting started, and writing was invented. We call this the Uruk period because Uruk was the world's first great city. If we could travel back in time, we'd recognize their lives, their cares, and their environment. It's not that different from ours. There's no way to know what the future holds, but I would bet that in a few thousand years, if they're still teaching courses about the history of the world, they'll include societies from ancient Mesopotamia to at least the 19th century in the category of ancient history and make generalizations that apply to all of us. All of this is to say that this lecture covers a crucial moment in human history, the early development of urban civilization. My students often assume that life in the first cities was much more chaotic and violent than now, but there's no evidence to suggest they're right. People seem to have adjusted to city living quite quickly and to have developed new norms of behavior. They also became more technologically innovative and more interested in the world beyond Mesopotamia. The place to start exploring this era is the city of Uruk, not far from Eridu in southern Mesopotamia. Scholars generally agree that by 3500 BCE it was the biggest city in the world. It was surrounded by an immense brick wall that enclosed 260 hectares. That's about 642 acres, the size of a big university. That doesn't sound big for a city today, but it was huge for its time. Uruk had two major temple precincts, with a temple at the center of each, and surrounding courtyards and buildings. One was dedicated to the goddess Inanna, who was the goddess of love. The other was dedicated to Anu, the god of the heavens. The number of people called on to build these temples must have been enormous. One theory suggests that the temples took about 100 years to build and were immediately rebuilt as soon as they were finished to keep the population constantly employed. The temples would have been as impressive to visitors as medieval cathedrals were in their own time. One of the temple buildings was constructed of stone, which was rare in this area. Another had an eye-dazzling mosaic of colored geometrical patterns. These were made with clay cones, impressed into mortar on huge interior columns, and then polished. As many as 25,000 people lived in the city of Uruk at this time, but they weren't like modern city dwellers. The whole economy was based on farming, and most of the citizens would have owned or worked on farmland around the city. This was true throughout Mesopotamian history. Most Mesopotamian city dwellers walked out to the fields in the morning, spent their days farming, and returned to the city when it got dark. The efficiency of farming improved during the Uruk period with the invention of the plow. No longer did farmers have to dig holes in the ground and poke seeds into these openings in the earth. The blade on a plow, drawn by an ox or a donkey, could turn the soil over much more effectively, and the farmer could plant the seeds as he walked behind. Canals had also improved since the Ubaid period, which had lasted from about 6000 to 3800 BC. Now the Mesopotamians could build canals big enough to sail boats in. The soil in the fields was naturally fertile. It was made up of silt that had washed down the river Euphrates over the eons. With effective irrigation and the plow, the fields became even more productive. Uruk peoples also improved bronze production and invented wheel-made pottery, wheeled transport, the cylinder seal, and a writing system. They also created an effective system of centralized government, though they still don't seem to have been ruled by kings. Let's look at each of these innovations in turn. Early bronzes weren't made with the classic mixture of copper and tin, for the most part, but instead with copper and arsenic. The arsenic made the bronze much stronger and more useful for tools and weapons than simple copper. Bronze tarnishes to a green patina if it's not polished, but it doesn't rust, and old bronze objects could always be melted down and reformed into something new. It was a wonderful new material. The people of the Uruk period figured out how to cast bronze in molds, so the metal could take just about any shape. It was used to make sculptures, bowls, cups, shields, daggers, razors, knives, mirrors, a vast array of things. The amount of copper imported from the Gulf and from Turkey must have increased enormously to meet the new demand. People didn't stop using stone tools. Those were still needed by many in society, but bronze became the material of choice for people who could afford it. Meanwhile, pottery seems to have lost some of its prestige. If you could eat from a bronze dish, why bother with a ceramic one? The pots made in the Uruk period became less interesting than those from the Ubaid period, perhaps because elite vessels were now made of metal. One kind of simple bowl has been found all over the place in the Uruk period. It's called a beveled rim bowl. These were made in molds and by the thousands. They're coarse and undecorated, almost as though they were made to be used and thrown away. Some scholars think they were used to measure and distribute rations to workers. Other kinds of pottery, jars, dishes, cups, and so on, began to be made in much larger quantities than before, but not in molds like the beveled rim bowls, or coiled by hand like the earlier Ubaid pots. Potters started to use the pottery wheel. A sort of mass production replaced the fine handmade ceramics industry of earlier times. It's possible that the invention of the pottery wheel preceded the actual wheel. Wheels seem so obvious that we tend to assume they were invented very early. Think of all those cartoons of a caveman standing next to a big stone wheel. But it's not an obvious development at all. Whole civilizations in other parts of the world managed to grow and thrive without ever inventing the wheel. To be of any use, a wheel needs to be perfectly round and sturdy and securely attached to an axle that won't break. In turn, the axle needs to be attached to a box or carriage and must be able to turn freely without getting jammed. And the whole contraption must be able to turn corners. The invention of the wagon was a marvel even when the wheels were made of solid wood and the wagon rode on 4 heavy wheels. A wheeled cart could carry a great deal more cargo than a person could, and more cargo than could be put on the back of a donkey. Its closest parallel was a boat, but boats were no help if goods needed to be transported beyond the banks of a river or canal. Cylinder seals began to be used in the Uruk period to identify people who were responsible for the production of goods and their movement. In the Ubaid area that preceded the Uruk period, stamp seals were already being used further north. But once cylinder seals were invented, they became a fixture of Mesopotamian society for the next 3,000 years. They were ingenious. In today's society, we use signatures to attest to things. We sign credit card receipts, contracts, agreements, letters, and so on. A signature is a kind of commitment. In the Uruk period, writing was just beginning, and people hadn't started using it to write names. So no one had a signature. Actually, that was true throughout Mesopotamian history. Even after writing was used extensively, people didn't sign their names. But you could buy a seal or be given one, and you could use this seal to identify things as yours, or denote that you had been somewhere and approved something. The seal provided evidence of your involvement, even when you were away. This is a remarkable intellectual development, and similar to writing, which developed during this period as well. We'll come back to that in a bit. People who've seen cylinder seals, only in photos, often assume they were large. They were tiny, just an inch or 2 in height. Each one was a cylindrical bead, usually carved out of a hard stone, with a scene engraved in negative relief. When the seal was rolled on clay, the scene appeared as an endless frieze that could cover as much of a surface as you needed. Images repeated over and over. The intricate scenes carved on these earliest cylinder seals can take your breath away. When you blow up the image to the size of a book page or computer screen, you can see an amazing amount of detail. One example shows a shepherd, or perhaps a priest, extending his arms toward a flock of 6 horned goats. You can see the plants in the man's hands, the details of his face, his clothes, and his hat. Each of the goats is also carefully depicted. It's astounding that an ancient craftsman, working without a microscope, could have created this perfect little scene in negative relief on the curved surface of a small hard stone cylinder. In later times, cylinder seals became formulaic, but in the Uruk period, the artists were still experimenting, discovering what could be represented in this new medium. Perhaps the 2 most important developments of the Uruk period were the creation of a form of government capable of administering a state, and the invention of writing. Unfortunately, we don't know all that much about the government, other than that it existed. and that it used the new writing system extensively to keep records. There are no paintings or statues of kings, no secular palaces dominating cities. There are some small sculptures of bearded men wearing belts. They don't seem to be gods. Gods almost always wore horned helmets in Mesopotamian art. They might well be priests, and perhaps they were in charge of Uruk. Powerful men might have been in charge of each of the major cities that were growing during this period. But these men may well have ruled as representatives of the gods rather than as kings. Each city had a particular god that was believed to live there and watch over it. Perhaps the rulers had a close tie to the city god. Writing was a real breakthrough, even though it might not have seemed so initially. The first written signs weren't attempts to represent language. They seem to have been memory aids. Just as a cylinder seal could give evidence of the identity of a man who'd sent off a shipment, a picture of a cow or a bushel of wheat could record what was in that shipment. Two marks next to a picture of a cow could indicate that 2 cows were sent, and so on. For hundreds of years, from about 3200 BCE onwards, this was the type of writing that was done. There's no way to know what language was being represented. A picture of a cow could be read as the word cow in any language at all. Just think of how useful this was, though. With a way to keep track of numbers and commodities, the administration could record taxes, or tribute to the temples, or rations, anything that was coming in or going out from places of storage. This form of script is known as proto-cuneiform, and it was written down on the same material that had long been used for impressing seals, lumps of clay. The signs were drawn into the clay using a sharp stick or reed. The earliest proto-cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia were well made, divided neatly into rectangles with straight lines, and filled with the carefully drawn signs that represented numbers and commodities. What could be duller, and yet at the same time more practical? Faced with the impossible task of memorizing mind-numbing sequences of objects and numbers, people invented a tool that eliminated the need for memorization. With writing, they had an easy method with which to recall these things. One problem, though, was that the writing system initially couldn't record the names of people. An ingenious solution was to use the rebus principle, which is an allusional device. Someone's name could be broken up into syllables, with each syllable represented by a picture of the thing that had that name. So, if your name in English was Barbie, you could write the name with a picture of a bar and a picture of a bee. The Sumerian language, which was common in Sumer, the southern part of Mesopotamia, happens to be supremely well suited to writing this way, because almost all the words were one syllable in length. The word for arrow, for example, was T. If you had the sound T in your name, you could represent that syllable with a picture of an arrow. The word T also happened to mean life, so you could write the word life with an arrow as well. This principle made it possible to write just about every word in Sumerian. And now, with signs for sounds, as well as signs for whole words, the writing system could be used to list commodities and record who sent them, along with what was still owed, and who had fulfilled a work obligation, all the details that helped a newly urban society to run smoothly. And that, for ages, was enough for writing to do. Centuries passed before anyone thought of writing for a more literary purpose. Throughout Mesopotamian history, most people never learned how to write. A particular group of professionals, whom we called scribes, mastered the process, and were employed in keeping records for the leaders of the community. It must have become clear early on that writing needed to be consistent. Each scribe couldn't invent his own sign for cow, so someone must have chosen among the signs that had been created and streamlined the system, rejecting many signs and bringing uniformity. And over many generations, writing did become consistent. It also became more abstract. Gradually, the early picture signs evolved into simpler signs made up of straight lines with wedges at the ends, which could be written much more quickly. Scribes made the wedge-shaped lines by pressing a reed with a rectangular end into clay at a slight angle. The Latin word for a wedge is cuneus. This is why scholars called the Mesopotamian writing system cuneiform. Any cuneiform sign could be read as a syllable, or as representing a whole word, called a logogram, like the ampersand or the @ sign in our own writing system. Early writing didn't have any punctuation, and scribes didn't put spaces between words. Cuneiform was originally written in rectangular boxes, each of which contained a phrase or coherent unit, such as a number and a commodity. This form of writing included hundreds of signs, each of which had several possible values depending on its context. It was very complicated. Not only did a scribe need to memorize all the signs, he had to know the spellings of words, which was surprisingly consistent, and the correct legal or administrative terms to use. And he needed to be good at mathematics, to do the accounting necessary to keep track of palace inventories or taxes, and later, for being able to survey fields and determine their area, and to divide up estates. The scribes seem also to have made their own writing materials. Each scribe needed to know where to obtain fine, consistent clay and how to cleanse it, so not the smallest impurity would get in the way of the tiny cuneiform signs to be impressed on the tablet's surface. He also needed to know how to shape the clay into tablets that would be just the right size for his work, and how to determine the exact moment when it was still soft enough to write on, but not so soft that it could end up covered with his fingerprints. Faced with the need to master this vast amount of knowledge and skill, someone must have thought of creating schools in which scribes would be trained. This was probably initially a type of apprenticeship. Just as boys learned from their fathers or from an expert how to farm or make tools, some boys now learned how to write in cuneiform. Very early on, a shared curriculum with the same texts was used in cities from Syria to the Persian Gulf. Long lists of words were put together, forming the core of what each scribe needed to learn in school. These lexical lists have been found in many archaeological excavations, often with the words in exactly the same order. The lexical lists also provide us with a window into the Mesopotamian conception of knowledge. The words define the world, society, and the universe. They were not organized alphabetically. There was no standard order for cuneiform signs. But some lists were organized based on sound. Words that sounded the same in Sumerian, yet might have had different meanings, were grouped together. Other words that started with signs that looked similar were also grouped together. A third type of list had a conceptual framework, grouping words in categories. One list in this group is almost 10,000 lines long and covered several clay tablets. It focused on terms that would have been used frequently by a scribe during his career. The list included legal and administrative terms, trees, wooden objects, reeds and objects made of reeds, clays and objects made of clay, types of leather and objects made of leather, metals, domestic animals, wild animals, cuts of meat, stones, plants and vegetables, birds and fish, textiles, geographic terms, and food and drink. The words in the list were Sumerian, but the list also gave their translations into another local language, Akkadian. Akkadian was the main language in the area right to the north of Sumer, a region called Akkad. This was near modern Baghdad, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flowed near one another before separating again. Akkadian is a Semitic language that's related to modern Arabic and Hebrew. Both languages, Sumerian and Akkadian, were spoken in Mesopotamia at least from the very beginnings of writing. It's unclear, however, where these languages originated and how or when the speakers of these languages arrived in the valleys of the Euphrates and Tigris. Archaeologists have found a remarkable thing about this period. The ancient people from around Uruk seem to have set up colonies right across Syria, Iran, and Turkey. There are sites in these distant lands with Uruk-style architecture and pottery, as well as cylinder seals and tools. Unlike the typical interaction in the earlier Ubaid period, when people were merely influenced by one another, the Uruk people seem to have physically moved and settled in the new colonies. On the other hand, they were not building an empire. That didn't happen for centuries. Instead, these early colonies were probably designed to facilitate trade, to get obsidian, copper, lapis lazuli, wood, building stone, and so on, back to the southern Mesopotamian people who really needed it. Three different types of colonies developed. Some southern Mesopotamians built settlements in unoccupied areas. Others conquered existing settlements, and yet others lived peaceably side by side with locals in the places they moved to. Hamukar, an Ubaid period town in Syria, was one of the places conquered by the Uruk people from the south. Archaeologists have found evidence of buildings that were burned down and walls that toppled. An excavator described the scene vividly. He said, "The attack must have been swift and intense. Buildings collapsed, burning out of control, burying everything in them under vast piles of rubble." The excavator noted that this is the earliest known evidence of organized warfare, and that it helped the Uruk people take over. New buildings were built on top in the Uruk style on top of all that debris. Amazingly, the Uruk people seem even to have been in contact with Egypt, hundreds of miles away. Around this time, Egyptian tombs were built using the Mesopotamian niche and buttress style of architecture. Egyptians also began to use cylinder seals, and Mesopotamian boats appeared in Egyptian art. Egypt was rich in gold, which might have made it an appealing place to Mesopotamian traders. It's unlikely that the Uruk people tried to set up a colony there, but they do seem to have been in contact. Maybe Egyptians even traveled to Mesopotamia. For some reason, this brief flurry of contact ended quickly, and for centuries after the Uruk period, the Egyptians and Mesopotamians appear to have been weirdly unaware of one another's existence. So to sum up, if you had lived in Uruk around 3200 BCE, you might have guessed that you were living in the most advanced civilization that had ever existed up to that point, and you would have been right. Humans were controlling the landscape and the built environment more successfully than ever before. They did so under a new form of state that might have been led by religious rulers, priests perhaps, and which used writing to keep the administration running smoothly. Thank you for wandering through history with the Sleepless Historian. If these ancient tales brought you calm or curiosity, give this video a thumbs up, subscribe, and tap the bell to never miss a journey. Share your thoughts in the comments. What part of the past should we explore next? For more soothing stories, follow us at Calm Historica. Until our next adventure, rest well and let history's whispers carry you into the night.